Welcome everyone. Thank you for being here, Alan Brouilette, to help out also. We have already gone through one module of 3. It was called Agile 101 and Agile 102. We talked about the general idea of Agile thought and about how one is or becomes Agile or thinks about being Agile. And now in these last 2 modules, this one on Scrum and another one on Kanban, we'll sort of dive a little bit more deeply into how you actually do something Agile on purpose. And the doing and the thinking are different. And that's what really we're going to be going into today. And again, and I think I've mentioned this before, normally a full day of training in Scrum is what we would give to a team just starting out. And for someone who's learning it in a slightly more in-depth way to become a certified Scrum Master, those are typically 2-day, 16-hour courses that people would do. So spending 2 hours on Scrum is really not overdoing it at all. And we will cover fairly fully all of the highlights, and you will not have a PhD in Scrum yet, although you will know more than a lot of the people you work with from my own personal observation. So let's get moving, see what we've got. Goal of the module, that is this session and the next one, which I believe is next Tuesday, we're looking to have a working knowledge of the roles, that's the humans, and the artifacts, the things that we can see and touch, and the ceremonies, the activities that the team does. We're looking for roles, artifacts, and ceremonies of Scrum, and I hope to also spend some time on the sort of special nature of the Scrum team, because it is something special, and it's a reasonable argument to make that some of the special sauce in Scrum, some of where the sort of the magic comes from, is all around that team, and not so much about the other externally observable characteristics of it. So let's see, today's agenda. We could possibly cover all of the things in part 1 that are on the left there. We'll review the development model and the life cycle, and start to talk a little bit more about the product backlog and the product owner. It's fair to say that of the artifacts in Scrum, the product backlog, I think, may be the most important. It could be tied. There's a school of thought that says the product increment, the working software that the team completes at the end of each sprint, is also a Scrum artifact. So for those people, that one is actually the most important, but the product backlog is very, very key. And we cannot do it justice no matter how much we talk about it today. We'll go back into the Scrum Process Framework, and then talk a little bit about user stories as we dive down into some more detail on the product backlog, and take our first look at the Scrum team. And let me just invite questions. We don't like Q&A at the end as much as we like Q&A all throughout. So please, if you have questions or even comments, please just put them into the chat, and Brouilette will take a look at those and make them sensible for me, and we'll try to address them during the class. So this is the Agile Development Model. We took a look at this in one of the previous sessions. It's a very simple model, but it has very far-reaching consequences, and it's actually a profound difference from the way people used to do software development. And once again, we're back into the world of software development, which is where Scrum came from, and where it fits the most sensibly and with the least twisting and turning. So in the world of Scrum, all of the software that we are using or creating is described by as a set of features. And if you think, and I'm going to guess that nearly all of you bank online, and I'm going to guess that you have the same experience I do, which is when you log into your online financial system, you are greeted with a bewildering array of options. You can click on things to show your account. You can click on things to get research information. You can click on things to get services from the institution. There's all kinds of stuff to do. There are various displays of all of your filthy riches that you have accumulated, or the lack thereof. Those are the ones in red. And from the software developer's point of view, each one of those identifiable things is called a feature. Everything you can click to take you somewhere is a feature. Every way of displaying information is a feature. All of those things are features, and each of those can be built separately, one at a time, as if it were its own software development project. And we would take the time to define it, and we would do technical design as needed, and we would also do user experience design as needed. We would code it, which is the central, but not by all means, but not necessarily the most important or even the only piece of work that we do. We would code it. We would go through various levels of testing, mostly concentrating on automated tests for some reasons we may or may not have time to get into today. Unit tests, acceptance tests, and integration tests. We might document the feature either for users or for ourselves in some technical documentation, and then we'd move on. And so we have a team working on these separate features over time, and they constantly add them to the system that's under development in the iterative development model that we've already talked about, and that's how they go ahead and do that development. In order to take advantage of that, we have this idea of the Scrum Process Framework, and we're going to go into this a little more deeply today. The point I want to make kind of with this overview of the Scrum Process Framework is there's actually a lot of stuff going on. There are a lot of parts, a lot of pieces to this puzzle, a lot of gears and wheels and things spinning and active humans involved, and it is I don't know if there's such a thing as the circular process, but it's a repetitive process in that we go through a sprint, which is what we call an iteration when we're doing Scrum, and we go all the way back to the beginning and start all over again. So this is the overall view of kind of everything that happens. If I was really mean and lazy, we could do this entire talk and the next one completely only using this slide, but that's just sort of no fun at all and a little bit too difficult. Alan, have we got anything? Do you have anything?
We are, sorry, Doc, we are currently trying to figure out why we're capped out at 100 people. So I have not been following, let's see.
Continue to do that before the airplane crashes.
Yeah, thank you. Is user training typically included in a feature sprint, or is that saved for the end?
User training. So like everything else, the preferred answer is that user training is ongoing. Although because we start to deliver sooner and we do more deliveries over time, this is actually a big thing for some customers, but generally you would expect there will be some of your quote releases that you give to end users for real production paid use, and others that you just create in order to kind of play with and understand the system as you're building it. So the general rule would be train whatever users need to be trained on whatever they need to be trained on as you go. Unless you happen to be, let's say, hypothetically in India and running a 10,000 person call center, and someone comes in with a minor change to your software and you have to stop operations in order to retrain 10,000 call center workers in the new features. And in that case, you'd want to handle things a little bit different. But the real burden of new things coming through comes on a sort of iterative, repetitive basis, a little bit at a time. You get to make the decision, actually, about how you want to handle that. All right, should I go on? I will.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let's first take a look at, please, there we go. The key part of this whole thing, we have a person and an artifact. We have the product backlog and the product owner. The product backlog is the list of features that we want to work on that we saw up in the development model. There are two overwhelmingly important characteristics of the list. And the list is kept by a person called a product owner, which is one of three named roles in Scrum. The product owner, owner is a bad word. A lot of really sloppy vocabulary in Scrum because the product owner doesn't own anything, but the product owner is responsible and accountable for having a good and workable and in some sense correct product backlog. They don't really have much power in Scrum. They often do in real life because people get them confused with a manager. They often think of a product owner incorrectly as a project manager. And so we think of the product owner more as the person who makes sure that all of the people involved can do all the things necessary to make sure the product backlog is in good shape. The two characteristics that we will talk about a little bit more, the two characteristics of the product backlog are really of product backlog items, and you'll occasionally see the abbreviation PBI. One is that each one describes something for users. And the simplest way to say it is it's something a user can see. It might be a link to click on, it might be a report, it might be a display, anything like that that a user can see. We often, the term of art that is used is it's user value. That gets us in a little bit of trouble because sometimes the things that we produce are so small that we wonder how a user could value it. But if a user can see it, then that's a legal and reasonable and defensible product backlog item. Then the other characteristic of the product backlog that is utterly crucial is the idea that it's in a certain specified order. And you notice that the product backlog is a single list. You don't see buckets for must have, should have, could have, would have, won't have, even if you pay me, and all the rest of the buckets that people often use when they're doing product planning. This is a single prioritized list and the team always works from the top of the list, which is defined as the most important, down in order, down to the bottom. And that has some consequences we won't really get to until the next session, as it turns out. But that is an extremely powerful technique that we use for making sure that the team is always working on sort of what we think of as the most important thing right now. And normally, product backlog priority is affected by the agendas and the thinking of all kinds of people, the team, the product owner, stakeholders, customers, articles in newspapers. It can be all kinds of different things, but it's up to the product owner to synthesize all of that into one ordered product backlog. And in cases where there are big conflicts about deciding what the order should be, the one superpower the product owner is given is that they get the final decision. Oftentimes that devolves down to the product owner is left alone to prioritize the backlog, which is definitely a second place approach.
All right, we got some questions here for you, sir. Janella, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I didn't know I would have sound.
Hi.
I was just wondering how the product backlog is different from a roadmap.
Oh, good question. I would say offhand that a product backlog differs from a roadmap, principally in granularity. These are features that we're going to be building kind of on a day-to-day basis in the team. So there might be things like create a place to put your name in on the login screen. And it wouldn't be things like allow people with allow Macs to use the system. So the product roadmap is also in order. It's in order of time, but it's usually very high level and big things. They're things that will take the team weeks, if not months, to build, whereas these are things that typically of a size that will take the team hours or days to build.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to combine these two now. Peter and Teresa have asked, I think, related questions. Is the product owner part of the development team, and who's the boss of the product owner?
The product owner is a part of the Scrum team, and we'll be talking about the team a little while later. But I'm carefully using that term, Scrum team, and you'll see why when we get there. But the product owner, the Scrum Master, and the rest of the team are considered the Scrum team. They are considered peers. No one is their boss because they are an empowered, self-organizing team. Within a company, the product owner will have a boss, but the very best Scrum implementations do not have the sort of actual corporate boss of the Scrum Master dictating what they do. It's up to the product owner and the team to put together the winning product that they're building. Very nuanced question there. Very, very important.
Next one, where do non-user development tasks, for example, refactoring, get folded in, not user visible work?
The best place and the shortest answer is that they get folded in as part of doing user visible work. So I would refactor when I'm working on a feature that hits that code. And that's actually something that we expect developers to do on a daily basis. If I have chores or cleanup to do, I want to try to do them only in as much as I need to do them in order to deliver some value. And we really try to, in a very disciplined and rigorous way, put the emphasis on spending our effort at delivering value, and everything else we try to do the least amount possible.
All right, on you go, sir.
On I go, or perhaps not. Let's see. There, how's that? All right, so sprint planning is the first part of the Scrum Process Framework. The entire team is involved. There are inputs from all over the place. It is stage managed and facilitated by the Scrum Master. The most important participants are the product owner and the rest of the Scrum team, and they talk about what the team will be focusing on that particular sprint. We'll talk some more about it, I think, at the beginning of next time. After sprint planning, the team gets right into doing the sprint. It may be that I'm having real problems here, and I don't know where they're coming from, but I apologize, it's taking so long to switch slides. There we go. So during the sprint, we have three things going on. We have the team executing, and in the center, you can see the team over and over and over again, picking up stories and building them and getting them complete. Each day, the team has a meeting called the Daily Scrum. That becomes important now that we've learned that there is no boss, there is no one directing the team to do certain things. That's kind of the nature of a self-organizing team. So instead, the team has the Daily Scrum where they self-organize. They sit together and say, what is our day going to look like? Who needs to do what with whom and when, so that we can do our best work today. And they also spend some time planning for the future by engaging in an activity called backlog grooming, where the team sits together and makes sure that the priorities of the backlog are good, that the stories that are near the top of the backlog, the ones they'll be working on next sprint, are well understood, the stories are well written, and they're ready to take on those stories so that when they come to the next sprint planning, things will be all set and ready for them to go. And God, these are brutal. We get to the end of the sprint. Three important things happen. We produce what's called a product increment. It is also called potentially shippable software. That means that whatever it is, it's fully formed. It may only have a few features in it, but it has a little bit more in it than it had at the beginning of the sprint, and it is at a quality level that is, it's fully tested, fully integrated, where it is considered working software. We're done with it, and we'll be moving on to be building new stuff in future sprints. We also have two important ceremonies: the sprint review, where we go over what we've built with interested parties, such as stakeholders and customers, maybe other teams. And then we also have the sprint retrospective, which is the time that the team spends looking at itself and trying to see how it can do things better. And for those of you who really were paying a lot of attention, you might start to notice that how Scrum is actually implementing the values from the Agile Manifesto and the principles also. If we were in a larger course, what we might actually do is take a while, maybe like a half an hour, 45 minutes or an hour, and actually go through and identify where in Scrum each of the principles and values are implemented, just to cement that idea.
Two questions coming in here, Doc, possibly more all of a sudden. First one, Janella Song, you're on deck. Janella, go ahead.
Hi again.
Hi.
So when you're considering whether or not a product is ready to be shipped, a lot of times it's about whether or not it's functional, it's been tested, it's got no bugs, it's good to go. How do you also prioritize the visual design of that product when considering whether or not it's ready to be shipped?
I think I have a two-part answer. You'll have to tell me if I'm wrong. The first one is so like everything else, we attempt to do visual design and user experience iteratively as we go. We also have the power to build a really ugly feature and come back and write and do and execute another story that says, now add this user experience, this visual design to that existing feature, which is perfectly fine. The idea is that, and so that's considered, you can consider in a certain sense the graphical design, the user experience design as another feature over top of the functional thing that's going on underneath it. The decision as to what you want to give to customers as finished product is strictly up to the team, largely facilitated by the product owner. And it's essentially, it's up to the team where those where those things fit. There's no one to scold, there's no one to argue or demand. There is only a team that includes designers that to decide when things look right, when they need more work, when they're ready to be, when they're ready for prime time and when they're not. I hope I got my 2 points in there. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Good.
All right. I'm going to go a little bit out of order here. Do you want questions on retrospectives yet, or do we have more coming on that?
Let's save those.
All right. Then Chris, you want to go ahead and give this question? All right. Possible Chris doesn't have audio, so I will read it. What happens when multiple features depend on a single invisible activity? For example, pulling a data set. Say data visualization uses XYZ data set to create chart A, graph B, and report C. Are each of those individual features, even though XYZ data set isn't exactly something an end user would see directly?
Yes, and the way you handle that's a good question. It's not too difficult to deal with because the Scrum team is a small bunch of people. They're all working together on a daily basis, and they're only working on a couple of things at a time. So it's not impossibly complicated, but the straightforward answer is whichever one of those multiple features is the one you build first, you build that one and have it use that kind of shared underlying functionality. Then when the next one comes along, you build that one and make any adjustments to what's already been done so that the two of them can share it. Then the third one comes along and you build that one and so forth. So you integrate them as they go, and you simply choose an order. So for instance, we're going to do, let's support MasterCard credit cards today, and tomorrow we'll build in support for Visa, and the day after we'll build in support for American Express. So each of those obviously shares a bunch of underlying functionality, but we do it, we do it sort of as we build in the features, we make them work as we go.
All right, Song, Ratliff, and Natasha, we will come to you when we get to the retrospective point.
So we now know what the world looks like from the external point of view. We've got these crazy people working in these fixed length sprints. Used to be up to a month. Now almost everybody does them as 2-week sprints. Every 2 weeks, the team spits out some working software called potentially shippable product increment, which has some new features in it. And we also, in a previous session, took a look at how that looks externally, how the sort of value contained in the system that you're building notches up stepwise over time, so that we're seeing stuff right from the very beginning. Again, the magic for all of this is the product owner and the product backlog. Team is always looking from the top of the backlog to build in those features. As we go forward in time, in theory and in practice, the longer we spend, the less important the stuff is we're working on. And so, if you're into the 6th month of a 6-month roughly project, the stuff you're building is really not going to be nearly as important as the stuff that you started with, because the really important things were way, way, way back up at the top of the product backlog. So this will become important because we are going to, in Scrum, we're going to cheat in order to never miss a date. And it is, and I will change that roughly to say never miss any reasonable date. And the way we're going to do that is we're simply going to vary scope. And because at the end of every sprint, we have working software, and it's at a known level of goodness. It's at a known level of feature, content, of scope. It's everything about it is known. It's already been touched and looked at and vetted and understood. And so we have the choice of making that one at the end of every sprint the one that we're going to ship out the door. So if we're all ready with our text editor, but we haven't put in the keyboard shortcuts yet, we can choose to go ahead and ship the text editor, because the keyboard shortcuts are not nearly as important as being able to create a blank new page and start to type into it. All features are not created equal, and we don't have to have them all done. We have enough. When we have enough that customers want to use it, we can ship it, and then expect to come back and ship again fairly soon to add more functionality if we need to. I think we've said all of this now. The only thing I would add, the product backlog is kind of a short and medium-term planning document, going back to the roadmap discussion. A typical product backlog for a team is good for planning out maybe 2 to 4 months, maybe 3 to 6, something like that. It takes a roadmap to plan out for a year or more. So each of these kind of has, there's a limit to this model or this way to characterize a system, and looking at a list of 500 individual features, even if it's in priority order, tends to be not particularly useful. So at a certain point, it's just too big. And we look to the product owner not to do all the work on the product backlog, but to make sure the product backlog is done right by everyone.
Teresa Halsell has a question. Teresa, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, this is brief. You use the word scope. A lot of my background is requirements. And so within the context of what you were just speaking about, is it in the context of design, budget, time, something better than that?
Yeah, so scope generally is some version of features, right? What things are actually included in the product. In Scrum, the quality is actually not variable. And of course, the team size is not variable. The thing that we vary is the amount of features, the amount of user value that we put into the product. So we can start with very little, and we keep adding user value until we're out the door. Every time I add user value, it's up to a known point of perfection, and we have the choice of adding more perfection to it or declaring it perfect and moving on. I don't know if that quite helps where you are. Budget is simply, I'm sorry, but I was just going to add, budget is how many sprints do you do? Because they all cost about the same, and
Okay.
each one adds a fairly similar amount of value to the product.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
On you go.
Okay, a quick summary of the product owner role. It's insanely difficult. It is big. It is full-time. There are ways to make it work in a scaled environment where there are multiple teams. But very soon after you start adding teams to a project, you start needing extra product owner help also. Along the left, kind of all of the things we look to the product owner for, they are the people who maximize the return on investment. They're the ones who decide what's important. They're the ones who, if the product makes it out the door and it doesn't succeed, users don't like it, it doesn't beat the competition, it's essentially on the product owner. And they have power over using the team as best as they can by determining what the team works on and the order that it works on them. And the final decision about product releases is also up to the product owner. And they're a part of every single activity that a Scrum team does, all the way, and including things, of course, like release planning and all of the Scrum ceremony. So product owners really need to be around. There was a sort of rule of thumb, because the product owner is constantly peppered with detailed questions about implementation during the sprint, because we don't like to waste a lot of time writing those down in documents. And we typically would like to say that on a really, really good, high-functioning Scrum team, you ought to be able to get an answer from your product owner in about 15 minutes if you have a problem that's stopping you from continuing to develop a feature. So it's a pretty demanding role for someone. Again, back to the product backlog, there is a way that we look at creating these magical little product backlog items, and the shorthand form for those is, they're called user stories. Where they came from was, well, let's see. First, getting back to requirements. Requirements are the way that we used to describe systems that people were going to build. They looked kind of like this. They had all sorts of formal language. They use that shall word. Nobody knows exactly what it means, but we're all a little bit afraid of it. A lot of official language. Nothing in here about making a user happy. Anything that's obvious anyway. But this is the way requirements looked. They typically, in a waterfall project, the starting assumption is we will give a giant list of, I won't say giant, we will give a list of requirements that must be met in order to be successful to the team, and let the team tell us how many people will take and how long it will take, which essentially pins down the budget. We tried that for 20 or 30 years. It didn't work very well, but it was the way that we did it. In contrast to that, someone during the years when Agile things were being developed, when people were creating those things, somebody said, you know, we have this problem where we keep building the wrong thing and users don't really like it. And I just keep thinking to myself, you know, what if we could get one of those users to come and tell us what their problem was and how they wanted to use the software? They could tell me the story of the way they wanted to use our product. And what if we just built that? You know, that would seem to be a quicker way to success as far as end users go than anything else. And that is where the idea of user stories came from. A user story looks like this. This is one for a feature called the dashboard. As a program manager, I want to see a high-level summary of program status and issues so that I can easily track and manage for success. So this would be a user story on the product backlog of some project management software that someone was building. Oddly enough, as I recall, the first software that was built to manage Scrum projects was done using waterfall in a waterfall project management company. Strangely enough, but you got to start somewhere. anyway, there are some important things about this. It tells you what user it is. It tells you what they really want and need and why. And this encapsulates for the development team a lot of information about what they should build and how they should build it and how it should behave. And so this format, this what's called the user story format, as a certain kind of user, which we call a persona. I want to do something. That's the feature. That's the action that I want to be able to take, so that I get a certain benefit. I get some value out of this, and that user story format is the basis now for what most people put into the product backlog. There is a larger discussion about what it really means to be a well-formed product backlog item, and it doesn't have to use the user story format. It's just that this is a real easy way to go through and understand the important things about developing stories for users. And I'll just add one final thing, which is something called acceptance criteria. You'll see at the bottom of this user story an acceptance criterion, which is really a way to add, it's not really an acceptance criterion, unfortunately, yet another vocabulary foul in Scrum. An acceptance criteria are actually ways of adding detail to the user story. So you'll notice here, this acceptance criteria, what this is about is, as I type in my password to log in, we want something to blot out the characters so that people looking over your shoulder can't read what you're typing. You've all seen this a million times. In this particular user story, the detail here for the team that's implementing it is that character that we want to obscure the real things that I'm typing is going to be a bright red triangle for some, the main reason being that happens to be the weirdest character I could find when I was building this slide. Okay, but clearly the product owner has something in mind there and they want it to be special. So that's really not a fundamental piece of the value here, but it is a reasonable and important detail for the team that's implementing. You could also do that as, hey, product owner, what did you want for the obscuring character? I'm working on that story right now. Or you could do it this way. So that's what acceptance criteria are for. And so that user story idea with acceptance criteria is the way that most people create most entries on their product backlog. Last point about, I think this is my last point about stories. Stories really are slices. And when I say that, what I mean is, and we've touched on this already in a couple of the questions, a story slices through the architecture. And if you look at not the lovely tomato on the left, which is very healthy, and the expensive slicing knife there, look at the right. That's a representation of the architecture, a typical layered architecture picture of a simple system. It used to be, and many of you will have been on teams where each team was organized according to a layer in the architecture. And there would be a database team, and there would be a business logic team, and there would be a GUI team, graphical user interface. And each of those teams would work on different parts of the stories. They would work according to the technical breakup of the architecture and not according to the value that we're trying to deliver to the customer. So product backlog items or user stories are thought of as being a vertical slice through that architecture, and the Scrum team together goes through and modifies or does work on whatever levels or layers or pieces of the architecture need to be modified in order to deliver the story. So the focus is on what is the action, what is the value we're trying to deliver to the customer, not what does the technology look like. And that flips a lot of things on its head, that flips many things on their collective heads. That makes everything a little bit different, is what I will say for this. So this idea that stories are slices and they're about user value and user visible features and not about the underlying architecture. And yes, there is underlying architecture. The team has to have knowledge and skills for how to work on those. And as we talked about before, a lot of that stuff is going to be invisible to the user. But what we're going to do is constrain the work that we do at any given time to be whatever we need to deliver that feature and no more. Okay, so we come to the Scrum team. And I think this is going to be our last topic for today. The Scrum team has some characteristics. It is long-lived and stable. Scrum teams, well, one of the things that all sports fans know is that bringing a lot of new people into your team screws things up for a while, even one star, because while they're sort of getting used to working on the team, teams of humans each have their own individual characteristics because every team of humans is different. Every human works differently. Interactions between humans are different. So we want this team to be able to work together for a long time so that they can use the retrospective mechanism to improve. It takes a long time for teams to get really, really good. But if you spend a year together, the same 6, 8, 9, 10 people, if you spend a year together getting a little bit better every 2 weeks, you're way better at the end of a year. But if your team keeps changing and you don't get to work together for that long and you don't get to work on long-term improvements, then you're not going to get that kind of benefit. We want the team to be dedicated because we want it to be the most productive. We know that the faster that we build things, the less intellectual capital we lose, the less confusion we have, and of course, the quicker time to market we'll have. So the idea that a team can do the best for its organization by working on several different projects is not really the best, and it's not the way we do it in Scrum. We work closely and carefully on one project at a time. The two big things, and I'm being a little artificial here because all of these things are important. The team is cross-functional. It has a set of skills that enable it to do everything required to build a completed shippable product. So we would expect it to have various kinds of coding expertise and tech writing expertise, or what we call now, tech writing is the old term, now it's often called content creation. We might have designers, we might have business analysts, we might have all kinds of test writers. There's any number of different special talents that a team needs. The self-organizing team needs to have them all in order for them to build completed functionality. And they're self-organizing. They are in charge of their own workspace. They're not in charge of things outside of their workspace, so they don't, in particular, they don't decide what they're going to work on, right? We saw that comes from, that's basically affected through the product owner and captured in the product backlog, but they do get to decide how they're going to do their work, and they're expected to do that, and they take responsibility for the quality of that work and also for meeting the commitments that they make. We know that Scrum teams are meant to work face-to-face. We don't write everything down because that turned out not to be effective, but what is effective is people speaking to one another face-to-face. We used to call this co-located, but in the modern world, face-to-face also includes video because that's what we do. But the idea of people talking to one another is really the important thing all the time. And the size of a Scrum team is crucial. It's carefully chosen at 5 to 9 people. Below 5, Scrum might be too much. You don't need all of this superstructure for people to organize themselves. But over 9 people, several bad things happen. One of them is that the number of interpersonal communication channels that open up between 9 people is just too big. But more importantly, above 9 people, and your team tends to segment, and you will actually end up with 2 teams or 3 teams underneath rather than one team working together. And so we're looking for that team dynamic, and we want to make sure that the humans are comfortable with one another in the larger team, so we don't go any more than 9 people. Everything then is very manageable. The team's problems are only so big. The amount of work the team can do is only so big. The amount of code they can write and test, the number of bugs they can create each sprint is all very manageable. And we talk about the Scrum team, we talk about the product owner and the Scrum master, And also, many people will call the folks who actually do the work the delivery team or the development team. And that's why we stay away from, I stayed away from that vocabulary a little bit earlier. We don't make individual designations of people. We don't have a lead technical person. We don't have a database architect. We don't have a front-end developer. We don't have a back-end developer. Yes, people will be those things, but what's important on a Scrum team is the sum total of that together. And we're looking for that team, that entire team to own things together, so we don't want everybody differentiating according to job titles. This is a picture of a Scrum. A Scrum comes from the sport of rugby. This is meant to sort of encapsulate this idea of modern product development being kind of difficult and fast and dynamic and changing, requiring a team to work together extremely closely in close communication without external direction. Either these teams may not get to talk to their coaches for the next 5 minutes or more of play, and yet they have to reorganize as the conditions change on the field in this particular sport. Also, you'll notice they have to be very careful of dental issues, but that's a different thing entirely. Anyway, that is why the term Scrum is used for this particular kind of software development, because it's meant to capture the idea that it is a little bit, it's slightly chaotic, but there's an overall organization to it, and it's all left to the team to work that out for themselves. So we do have a very tightly defined idea of self-organization. Self-organizing team accepts their work from the customer. It makes and meets their own commitments. Neither the product owner nor some external manager or project manager nor the Scrum Master is empowered to go make commitments for the team. The team makes them together. The team decides how they will do the work, what technology they will bring to bear, what things they might need from outside. The team decides who does what work and how they'll meet their commitments, and the team takes responsibility for the final quality of what they've completed. So this is a very different thing from the sort of hierarchical, externally driven command and control organization that most of us are used to from the waterfall world. I keep expecting you to jump in all over me.
Yeah, you're doing great, and I was giving you time to finish. I know we're in the home stretch here, and then we've got some questions.
Yep, fair enough. Okay, so let me just point out that it is very different being on a self-organizing team than being on a directed team. On a directed team, managers always valued the just tell me what I'll do and what to do and I'll do it person, but you cannot be that kind of a person and be on an effective Scrum team. You're more expected to contribute to the way the team is doing things. So the right thinking there as well, I think the right thing to do might be this. I think this is not helping us. I think we should do it this way. You're never done by yourself unless the whole team is done. Right? So it's not like, okay, I'm done. You guys tell me when you're done. We'll move on to the next thing. It's like, I'm done. Who needs help? Because the commitments that the team makes are team-wide. And so it's a team effort thing working together to get that done. We don't look outside the team for answers. In the command and control hierarchy, which comes from a line of knowledge called scientific management that was invented around the turn of the last century in the early 1900s. The axiom was the boss is the one who has the final answer. The axiom here is the team has the final answer because the team are the ones that are closest to the work and they're in a much better position to know what their problems are. The team is always looking for ways to get better. And the team isn't really very happy with being told, no, they can't do something. And, no, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. And, and this happens in a lot of environments. And the best teams will say, well, if you can't do that and you can't do this and you can't do something else, what can you do? Right? What can we do to improve? What small step can we take? And by taking lots and lots of small steps and kind of refusing to accept externally imposed impediments, the team will improve over time. So yes, I'm done. Shoot.
All right, first question, Song Nanette. What's the prompt question for a sprint retrospective?
We're actually going to talk about that next time. It's not so much the prompt question as the setup for the mindset for the retrospective, and we will get into that next time.
Alex, Dan, or Jeremy, would you care to jump in and plug when that next time is?
Yeah, the next Basics of Scrum Part 2 is going to be held on Tuesday at 3 p.m. That's Tuesday at 3 p.m., November 12th, and that's Eastern time. So feel free to register at the link that I'm putting into the chat box, and you should be good to go.
Thank you much. All right, from Ratliff C, is sprint retrospective the same as a lessons learned activity?
I think the Venn diagrams would overlap, but a retrospective seems to be kind of fully, soup to nuts. It is kind of its own thing. And we'll talk more about it next time.
From Selena, when do you think user research should happen?
All the time. The team that I've worked with that's doing that the best that I've seen is login.gov, and that is the best example. User research can be broken down into user research for a particular user story or set of stories, and you can know when those are coming up towards the top of the product backlog, and you can actually plan out when you want to do your research for those things. So the A+ is figuring out how to do your user research incrementally, iteratively and incrementally, just like we do everything else.
From Eleni, I'm curious about the 15-minute ideal response time for a product owner. Why is that? And on urgency in general, how do teams figure out the cadence pushing how fast they roll out features?
So the thing about so the idea of agile development is right up until the time I code, it's possible to change our minds or learn something new or make a decision. And so there's this idea that it comes from the just-in-time idea of lean manufacturing. So many things are left unspecified or undecided until the very last minute. And so we don't like to write them down because it wastes a lot of time writing them down, and then half the time we don't understand what's written or it becomes out of date anyway. So instead we like what are you thinking right now about this feature? And the person who knows the answer for those things, the person who directs the understanding of what's to be built, is the product owner. So and we would love the product. So in effect, and I'm not sure this is a good analogy, but I don't think it's entirely wrong. If you thought of the product owner during the sprint in some sense as a living spec, you wouldn't be entirely wrong. So we don't want people sitting around wondering what to do if the product owner, is busy or lazy or asleep or something like that. And I'm sorry, but I forgot the second half of the question.
So did I. Hold on a second. Excuse me. On urgency in general, how do teams figure out the cadence pushing how fast they roll out features?
So it's easy. You just do the work and see what naturally occurs. We have an assumption in Scrum that the team will do the most work that they can. And we always we use the retrospective process to improve that number, to make that number bigger. But in the meantime, we are expecting that the team will not be found playing croquet on Thursday and Friday afternoons from noon to 5. We expect that the team is going to be a professional, motivated, agile team and do the most work that they can. And as they complete features, they will be ready at the end of the sprint. And though that number of whatever features are done will be the ones that are released. So it's how much can you build, not how much are you supposed to build.
Okay, got just a couple of minutes left. 2 questions to read and then one from Gwen. to get us out of here. A lot of planning should go into making sure the architecture can support all the features, right? So you're not having to go back and fix or redesign stuff each time a new feature is rolled out. When in the process does that happen?
So that's actually not the preferred agile approach to these things. There's the phrase is emergent architecture, and the idea of a fixed preordained architecture came in a world where we did not have the kinds of tools available that we have now. And in fact, you absolutely do want to build the minimal architecture you need to build the story you're working on right now. And as you need more things, then you add them as you go. And what that gives you in the end is you have spent the least amount of time possible in building architecture in order to deliver value. If you try to predict it up front, you end up doing a lot more extra work, which slows you down and wastes time and wastes effort, and provides a place for bugs to collect also. So yes, emergent architecture is the way to go, and it absolutely works.
I realize this may sound like waterfally heresy, but if you are still iterating on the design, content, visual, and UX, and know things will be changing, it seems wasteful to have developers start working on things. How do you get around that?
Maybe the simplest answer is in an agile environment, we learn by building. We really don't trust anything else is simply predicting the future and making decisions on behalf of users when we shouldn't be. So the right thing to do is build something small, get feedback, do some learning, and build the next small piece and the next small piece and the next small piece. So with the right thing there is not about it. In some sense, it's about discovering when it's good enough, not knowing up front and waiting till you get there.
Gwen, go ahead and ask the last one yourself. Yeah. All right. Gwen's question. One thing I'm missing is what happens when the implementation isn't good?
Well, you have one rockin' and rollin' retrospective, that's for sure. I think that should be the first thing. So this is where, so the testing protocols of the team come into play here, if I understand where you're going. But it's not so difficult to avoid that, because each time I build a story, and stories are small, we build them, in a day or two, or even less, maybe in a couple of hours. And when I build it, I build automated tests around it, and it becomes much easier to control and to make sure that the quality is kept high. So if the implementation is bad, what you'll typically find is a team that hasn't bothered with its test, with the test side of things. It's easy to fix. It's also very annoying, but it's also easy to avoid.
All right, gut answer, lightning round of one question. Assuming devs and the Scrum Master are stable, which would you prefer? A product owner who is well connected to subject matter experts but has never been a product owner and will leave in a few months when the project is done, or a product owner who isn't connected to subject matter experts as tightly but is a stable member of the team and stays with them through several different projects?
I'll go for stability every time, but either one of those situations is workable.
Very cool.